Today we're going to do something a little bit different. We are going to implement everything we learned up until now in these past many episodes to build a login system. So we will actually have a PHP application that can do something inside a website. And I do want to point out this is a very long video and I will have chapters in the description so you can actually skip ahead if you want to. But just to point out, this is going to be a long video, but it's also going to be very worthwhile. So if you do actually go through this video, you will learn many things. So this is going to be a very, very good lesson for you to just sort of write notes for and, just have next to you as kind of like a cheat sheet for something you want to build in the future. It is okay to be confused. Just rewatch certain parts of the video and make sure to write those notes that I was talking about. So you will get to a point watching this video where now you know a lot when it comes to PHP. I do also want to point out here that there is a tendency for long videos like this for people to get errors as they are following the video. And I just want to point out that 99% of the time when people write, "Hey Daniel, I copied your code exactly and I'm getting an error message. This code is not working." 99% of the time, it is because of a typo. It is because you don't have the same database as I do. So, some of the columns inside your code has to be changed when it comes to the names and that kind of thing. You misplaced the parentheses, any kind of syntax error is 99% of the time going to be the cause, even though you copied my code exactly. So I just want to point out here, look at the error message inside your website and then pinpoint where that is inside your code, because it will tell you the line that the error is on. And if you're just completely in doubt and you don't know anything about where to find that error inside your code, you're more than welcome to share it inside the comments so people can help you out. I do also want to point out that we will learn a lot of new things in this episode here. So we will, for example, learn how to combine our user ID from the database with our session ID to make it better for certain things. We're also going to talk about error handling, which is when you go inside your code and you actually check for errors before you actually run the code, because a lot of times you need to run error handlers in order to figure out if something is wrong. This could, for example, be if the user didn't fill in all the fields inside the form and then they submitted it. So you have to check for that and then say, "Hey, you forgot something." And then you go back to the form to tell them to fill in everything. Speaking about that, we're also going to learn how to write error messages inside our form. So if someone doesn't fill in all the inputs, then we're going to write an error message saying, "Hey, you forgot to fill in all the inputs." Or if the user submitted a username when they tried to sign up inside the website that already exists inside the database, because you can't have the same usernames, then we also want to create an error message. So we have to learn how to create error messages and to check for these things using error handlers inside our code to make this into a somewhat decent application. I do also want to point out that we're going to do something a little bit weird in this episode here, because we're actually going to organize our code in a MVC pattern, which is something that you usually don't talk about until you start talking about object-oriented PHP, which is when you start talking about classes and objects and that kind of thing. But just to kind of get you into the mindset of a MVC pattern early on, before we actually get into classes and objects, it is a very good idea, I think, to just kind of touch upon it and teach you the concepts behind it, so you're not completely confused once we actually have to start talking about classes and that kind of thing. So learning about the MVC pattern is just a really good idea. And I think this is a good opportunity to just sort of get you into the mindset of how to think in MVC patterns. The reason that the MVC pattern is a really good thing for you to learn about is because it is going to allow you to organize your code in a much more scalable way, so that once you've built much bigger PHP applications, then it is something that is going to be much more organized and better to look at, because it's not going to get all, jumbled together. And because right now we're creating what is called procedural PHP, which means that when we have some place inside our website where we need something specific to happen using PHP, then we create the PHP code in that place, which means that if I have another page inside my website somewhere where I need the same PHP code, then I have to duplicate the code, put it inside that page too, and then, all of a sudden we have these duplicates of code that is unorganized and, there's no need for it to be duplicated. So an MVC pattern is a very good thing to learn about, okay? So talking about that, let's actually go ahead and get started on this login system. We will talk about all the different security things that we have talked about throughout these lessons here. Of course, there is some security that we haven't talked about, but since we haven't talked about it, it's not going to get implemented in this video here. It's a way for me to say that this is a good start for a login system. Then you can always work on it later on when you start learning new things. So right now inside my website, you can see that I have a index page. I do have a main.css and a reset.css. These are just my style sheets. So if I want my website to look a certain way, then I can implement a style sheet to do that, because this is basic HTML and CSS, and this is something you should also know by now. So we shouldn't talk about style sheets because it's not PHP. So with that, I do want to show how my website actually looks like right now. So if we were to go inside my page here, you can actually see that we have a login system and we also have a sign up system. So we do have two forms that basically can go in. You can type your username and password to log in, or you can type in your username, password, email to sign up inside the website. So just something very basic in here. And of course, the way I created that is simply by going inside my index page, and I went down inside my body tag, created our login form, and I created a sign up form. And these are, just to point it out, very similar to each other. So one of them has an input that is called username, and it has a placeholder as username so the person knows what to type in here. And we do also have a password input. And the same thing goes for the sign up form down here. We do also have a username, we have a password, but we also have a email. So we can actually use an email to sign up inside the website. For the database, I do have a file in here that you don't need to have called db.sql. This is basically just my SQL code in order to create a table inside my database called users. So right now we have an ID, username, password, email, and a timestamp for when the user signed up inside the website. Again, if you followed my previous lessons, you should right now have a database with this exact users table. So this is not something you should need to put inside your database. But just to show you, if I were to go inside my database here, I do actually have my first database in here. It is the name of my database. And I do have a users table. Go ahead and ignore the comments table since that has nothing to do with this episode here. But inside my users table, you can see that I have a couple of different users already. These are from previous lessons inside this course, so there's no need for me to have them in here. So let's just go and delete these users. We can delete them one at a time by clicking delete, or you can tick them off here and say delete. And now we don't have any users left inside my users table. The first thing we're going to create inside our login system is going to be a connection to our database, since we need to connect to a database in order to actually do something with the database. Because when it comes to a login system, we need to be able to store the user's information somewhere. So the username, the password, the email, that has to be stored inside a database. So we need to connect to it. So I'm going to go inside my root folder. I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call this one includes. And I'm just simply going to put every single pure PHP file inside my includes folder. So any sort of PHP that isn't a direct page inside my website, but just has some PHP code that needs to run a script inside of it, that is going to go inside this folder here. So our database file is one of those files. So we're going to go ahead and right click on includes. We're going to go in here and say we want to create a new file. And I'm going to call this one dbh.inc.php for database handler. Inside this file, we're going to open up our PHP code. And I want to make sure that we go in and first of all create all our parameters. So we're going to create 4 variables. And each of these variables are going to be equal to a string of characters. In our case here, we're going to have a host name, which is going to be a local host if you're using XAMPP, which I am right now. You're also going to have the database name, which is the name of your database, which might be different from mine. But in my case, I call mine my first database. And then you need to have a database username and a database password. Now, if you don't know what your database username and password are, then you can, of course, just go inside your database and change these. I do have a tutorial on that inside this course here, which is a bit further back. But we do need to have these parameters here in order to actually query our database. So the next thing we need to have is a try-catch block in order to actually try to connect to our database. So we're going to run a try-catch block, which means that we right now try a bunch of code. And if it fails, then we want to throw an exception down here. Now inside the catch, I'm going to say that I want to throw a PDO exception. So we're going to say PDO exception. Do make sure you spell that correctly. And then inside of here, we're going to create a placeholder called variable E for exception. Now we're just going to go and create the error message straight away. So we're going to create a die function, which basically just terminates this script if something goes wrong in here. And we can actually generate a error message inside this die function. So we can, for example, say connection failed, connection space failed, colon space. And then we can add a message. So we can say we want to add our variable E. And we want to point to a method called getMessage. And in this simple way here, we now have a way for our error message to get displayed if we get some sort of connection error. So what I can do now is I can go inside this try block here, and I can actually try and connect to my database, or at least create a variable that is going to contain a object, which is going to be a connection object to our database. So what we can do is we can create a variable, call this one PDO. I'm going to set it equal to a new PDO object. And again, we haven't talked about object-oriented PHP yet, which is okay since that is a little bit further ahead in this course here. But this is going to be a new PDO object based off a connection class that is going to allow for us to connect to the database. So going inside this PDO object here, we can actually give it some parameters. So the first one is going to be what kind of database are we trying to connect to. So in this case, it is going to be a MySQL. And again, just to point it out here, some people do keep pointing out, even though I keep mentioning it, that MySQL databases are not outdated, but PHP MySQL functions are outdated. Okay, there's a big difference between the two. So MySQL databases are not outdated. Okay, so moving on, we're going to go ahead and tell it what kind of host we're trying to connect to here. And we do actually have our host up here. So I can just go ahead and copy my host and paste it down here. Now, something we haven't talked about that many times in this course here is the fact that when we do this, we usually concatenate. So, we'll do something like this, like we just did down here. But it is actually possible to take a variable and just copy it directly inside a string. And because PHP have, nowadays know how to just look at this and say, oh, that's a variable, then we can actually do that. So afterwards here, I'm going to add a semicolon, and then we're going to go ahead and add our database name, which is also going to be equal to our variable up here, which is called database name. And then after here, we can actually go ahead and say we want to add a comma, since now we have to add the last parameter, which is going to be the username and also the password. So we can say username, comma, and password. So we can actually paste that in down here. Now things are disappearing a bit off screen here, so I'm just going to go ahead and wrap everything so you can see everything inside my code. And we're going to add one last thing below here, which is going to be a couple of attributes for our PDO connection. So we're going to say we have this PDO connection. I'm going to point to a method which is called setAttributes. And then I'm going to go ahead and add some parameters inside this method here. Now, the first parameter is going to be to set our PDO error mode to exception. So it actually works properly inside our catch block down here. So inside the parameter, I'm going to say PDO : ATTR_ERRMODE for error mode. And then I'm going to set a second parameter, which is going to be that we want to set it to an exception. So we can say PDO ERRMODE_exception. And this is basically all we need in order to have a connection going. So with this file, we can now move on to the next file, which is going to be our config_session.inc.php. This is a file that is going to allow for us to configure our session. So we have different things that can help us make it more secure to run a session inside the website. So a hacker, for example, if they were to gain access to our session ID, then we update the ID every 30 minutes to make sure that, people have less time to do any sort of damage with our session ID. So there's many different things we can do in here to make our session a little bit more secure. The first thing I want to do here is, of course, make a new file inside my includes folder, which is going to be a config_session.inc.php. So inside this file, we're going to set a couple of things. I'm just going to go and copy paste from my notes here, since that is a little bit easier, at least for me, since I'm teaching this and I have a lot that we need to go through. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my PHP tags first, and then I'm going to include 2 lines of code, which is going to go inside our .ini file, inside our PHP folder, inside our server, and change a couple of ini settings. So right now we are setting our use only cookies and our use strict mode to true in order to make this a lot more secure when it comes to handling sessions. This is something that is mandatory. So anytime you do anything with sessions, make sure that you either change these inside the php.ini file or you change these using code like we just did here. Now, the second thing we're going to do is change our cookie parameters in order to make this even more secure inside our website. So I'm just going to paste in a block of code here. Essentially, this is a function called session_set_cookie_parameters, or params, which is going to accept an array inside of the parameters that allow for me to change things like the lifetime of the cookie. We can change the domain this cookie should work on, any sort of subpaths inside this domain here that it should work on. In this case, I'm saying it should work on any sort of path inside this domain here. We can also set secure to true, which is going to allow for us to only use this cookie inside a secure connection, so an HTTPS connection. And we're also setting HTTP only to true to avoid the user being able to change anything about this cookie using a script, for example, JavaScript inside our website. So there's a couple of things we need to set using this function here in order to make things a lot more secure when it comes to a session. Again, we did talk about this a few episodes ago, so if you missed that one, you're more than welcome to go back a couple of episodes to our session security video. We do need to add in one more thing, which is going to be a if condition that is going to run a update every 30 minutes, which will go in and take our cookie and regenerate the ID for that cookie. And this is something that helps us prevent attackers from gaining access to the cookie and then using that cookie for more than at least, maximum 30 minutes. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a if condition, which is going to go in and check if a certain session variable exists inside the website, because if it does not exist, then we need to create it in order to check when we last updated our session cookie. So what we can do here is I can go inside this if condition, and let's go and wait with the condition parameter for now, because that just confuses people. So inside the actual brackets here, what I'll do is I'll add in a couple of lines of code. The first one is going to be where we actually go in and grab our session and run a function called session_regenerate_ID, which goes in and regenerates our session ID to make it even better and more secure, because the default one that you get from doing the session_start is not very good. So doing this here is going to allow for us to regenerate it. And right now I may be asking, well, what session? Because we didn't actually start any session yet. So let's go ahead and do that right now. Let's go ahead and put in a session_start right above this condition here. So right now we started a session after we set all these parameters, of course. And then we went in and said we wanted to regenerate our session ID to make it better. Underneath here, I'm going to say I want to create a session variable. So I'm going to say we have a $_session. I'm going to call this session variable something like last regeneration. So last_regeneration. And I'm going to set this one equal to something called time. Now, time is a function we have inside PHP that just simply gets the current time inside the server. So by setting last regeneration equal to the current time, I can now check when is the last time we actually went in and updated our session ID, because that is going to be the timestamp inside this last regeneration session. So what I can do now is I can go inside my if condition and say I want to run a isSet function that goes in and checks if this particular session exists inside my website. Because if it does not exist, it means that we have not yet went in and improved our session ID, so that is something we have to do. But right now we're checking if it does exist, and we have to check for the opposite. So in order to do that, we write a exclamation mark in front of the isSet function in order to do the opposite. So basically we're checking if it does not exist inside the website. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create a else condition, which is going to go in and update our session ID after 30 minutes. So what we need to do here is we need to go in and say we have a variable called interval. And this interval is going to be equal to the time in seconds that I want to pass until we have to update our session ID again. So in this case here, there is 30 seconds to a minute. So we need to say 30 times the number of minutes that we want to actually pass. In this case, it's going to be 30 minutes. So what I'm going to do below is I'm going to run another if condition, because now we want to actually check if the current time minus the time inside our last regeneration is greater than or equal to 30 minutes. Because if it is, then we need to regenerate the ID again. So go inside this condition here, we can say if our time, which is that function we did before as well, minus our session called last regeneration is greater than or equal to our interval that we set up here. And if it is, then we want to regenerate the ID, and we also want to reset our last regeneration equal to the current time that we now again updated our session ID. So I'm just going to copy these 2 lines of code here and paste them below. But now there's an easier way to do things, because now we start getting into functions because we are duplicating code. So these 2 lines of code here are also down here. So, instead of having to duplicate the code every single time, we could go below here and create a function. And I'm going to call this function something like regenerate session ID. So now we have a regenerate session ID function, and I can take these 2 lines of code, paste them inside the function, and simply run the function inside where we need to have these 2 lines of code. So we can just paste that in there, semicolon, copy this line of code, and paste it inside up here instead as well. So now we are running the same code, but we're not duplicating code in multiple places. So going back inside my index page, we're now going to talk about these forms down here, because now we have to start creating the sign up form and the login form. And you will notice that inside my sign up form and inside my login form, I do have a action that points to a file that we do not have created yet. So we need to create these two files inside our includes folder. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on my includes folder, create a new file, and I'm going to call it login.inc.php. And I'm also going to create a file called signup.inc.php. So now we have the file that is going to actually run the code for signing us up and logging us in once we actually do get to those parts inside the website here. For now, let's go ahead and close down the login.inc.php file, since we don't want to talk about the login system until we actually created the sign up system, because the sign up system comes first, right? We need to sign up first and then log in the user. So let's go ahead and start with that. Inside this page, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to open up our PHP tag so we can actually run some PHP code in here. And then we're going to run a if condition to check if the user actually accessed this page legitimately. So did they actually submit the form in order to get to this page, or did they go inside the URL and try to access this page in a weird way by, trying to access it directly inside the URL? Because that is something we can do. So what I want to do is I want to go inside this condition here, and I want to say I want to run a $_server superglobal, and I want to check for a request method, which is going to be a post method. So we're going to say request_method, and I want to check if it's equal to a post method. If the request method is equal to a post method, it means that the user did get here correctly. If not, then they did not get here correctly, and we have to send them back to the front page. So that is something we have to do now. So if they did not get in here correctly, then we run a else condition, and then we just basically run a header function in order to send them back to the front page. So a header function looks something like this. We just basically go in and tell it where to send the user. So that would be a location, which is going to be back1 directory, because right now we're inside a includes folder with this file here. So we go back1 directory and then access the index.php file in order to send them back to the front page. I'm also going to go ahead and add a die function underneath here to make sure that this script stops from running. So if there's any other code in here that might accidentally get run, then we do actually stop the script from running. So that is a good thing to include in here. So the next thing we have to do inside our if condition here is to actually grab the data from the user. So inside my sign up form, I did actually have a post method that is called username, because that is one of the inputs that was submitted. And I'm going to set this one equal to a variable, which is called username. So again, just in case people are confused, if I were to go back inside my sign up form, you can see that down here, I do have an input, and this one is called username. So that is why I'm referencing to a username post method, because that is the method we chose for this form here. So going back inside the sign up page, I'm going to duplicate this down 2 more times since I have 2 more inputs. One is called pwd for password, and the other one is going to be called email. We're not going to do any sort of sanitation here, by the way, because I do know that some people may be pointing out that we have HTML special characters, or some of the other filter underscore inputs that we can use in order to check for certain things. But it is best practices to not do this until you actually output something inside the website, or you try to store information inside your website. So we're not going to do HTML special characters until we actually output something. Underneath here, I'm going to go ahead and run a try catch block, just like we did inside our connection file. And we're basically going to do the same thing here. So we can actually go inside our database connection and say we want to, actually run a exception and a error message if something were to fail. So we can go back in here and say we want to replace that. So basically we want to run a PDO exception, and we want to have a variable E, which is the exception. And then we can run a error message to say something like query failed instead of saying connection failed. So the first thing we're going to do in here is I want to require underscore once my database file, because we do actually need to have the database connection in order to actually connect to the database. So I'm going to link to my dbh.inc.php file. We do not need to say it's inside a includes folder because we're already inside the includes folder, so there's no need for that. And one thing I want to point out here is we will need to require some more files, because I did talk about something called the MVC model, which is something that we should talk about just a little bit this early on, because I want to get you into the habit of thinking in a MVC pattern, which is going to be very beneficial for you a little bit later on in this course here and in any other courses you might be taking inside YouTube, because the MVC pattern is something you just need to know about. So before we continue here, let's actually go and create our files for the MVC pattern. So I talked about the MVC model being a way for us to structure our code, which is going to allow for us to make this a lot more scalable, a lot more organized inside our code. And in order to do that, we're going to create a lot of functions that are going to have different purposes. So for example, we're going to have one file that is going to have functions inside of them that are used to connect to a database and actually query the database. Then we're going to create another file, which is going to be used in order to actually show data inside our website. So whenever we have any sort of PHP code that is going to show something inside the website, that is going to go inside the second file. And the third file is going to be for actually handling any sort of input or information that needs to get run inside the website. And this is what we call a MVC model. We have model, view, controller. And whenever it comes to any sort of application like we're doing right now, so right now we have a sign-up system and we have a login system. So we're going to go in and create a MVC file for our sign-up system and for our login system. So going inside our directory here, I'm going to go inside my includes folder. I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call this one signup_model.inc.php. I'm going to create a second file, which is going to be called signup_view.inc.php. And I'm also going to create a third file, which is going to be called signup_controller.inc.php. Controller is spelled CONTR, by the way. So now with these, let's go ahead and wait with the login system, because like I said, that is going to wait until a bit later. So for now, what we can do is we can actually take a look at these different files. So right now, if we were to go inside my model here, you can see there's nothing inside this file. Basically, these three files are going to have a bunch of functions inside of them. And depending on the file, we're going to have these functions do a specific thing. So they have a certain task they need to do. So inside the model here, that is going to take care of only querying the database and getting data or submitting data or updating data or deleting data. It's only going to interact with our database. And it's very important to point out here that these are very sensitive functions because these are interacting with our database, and that is a sensitive thing. So the only thing that is allowed to interact with these functions in here are going to be our controller file, because our controller takes care of handling input from the user and then uses these functions in here to actually send that information to these functions so they can actually do something with the database. So we're separating different tasks here. And I know that may sound confusing, but that is something that is going to be something you have to learn to do. So what I'll do to start with inside this model here, so I'm going to open up my PHP tags. And I want to activate something called strict types. And this is something you don't have to do. This is something that I like to do because it just sort of prevents more errors from happening inside our code if we were to write a typo or something or submit the wrong type of data. So by declaring that we want to set our strict types equal to true, it means that we are allowing our code to have something called type declarations. I will talk more about type declarations once we actually get to it. For now, just know that this is something we're going to have inside our code here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go and copy this code, make sure I save it and paste it inside my controller. Save it and paste it inside my view, because we're going to have this inside every single file. So going back inside our signup.inc.php file, we're going to include two more files underneath our database connection. The first file is going to be the model that we just created. So we're going to say we have a signup_model.inc.php, and then we do also have a signup_controller.inc.php. The order here is very important because that is going to be relevant for later when we do talk about object-oriented PHP and then instantiating different objects based off classes. And that has to be done in this order here. So this order here is just a good habit for you to get into it. So the model is always going to come first after the connection. And then we're going to have the controller after the model here. In a situation where you did also need to connect to the view, that would actually go in between these two. So you would have the signup view in between the model and the controller, just to point it out. But for now, we don't need to have the view. We're just going to go and delete it here. And again, if this is confusing to you about model view controllers, just go ahead and wait, because it will make sense in a second. I promise, okay? I know it doesn't make sense when you get started on it, and I'm sitting here talking about it. But since we haven't actually done any sort of code based on it yet, it is going to sound confusing. So you're not alone if this is confusing you. It will make sense in a second, okay? So going below here, the first thing we're going to do inside our try block here, after actually grabbing these files, is going to be running error handlers. Now, error handlers is a way for us to go in and actually do any sort of prevention to make sure that things are running appropriately, so to speak. So things are running correctly inside our code. So if the user were to go inside your website and not type something inside one of the inputs when they're trying to sign up, then we want to take them back to the front page and say, hey, you forgot to sign something up in there. So that's the thing we have to do in order to make sure that we have some sort of error prevention happening inside our code. And some of you may say, well, Daniel, can't you just go inside your index.php and go inside one of these inputs here and include a required attribute? And with this attribute, we can no longer submit this form, right? Wrong, because this is front-end development. This is client-side languages. So HTML, CSS, JavaScript cannot be used when it comes to security, or at least we cannot rely on them when it comes to security. That should always be done using a server-side language. Because if I were to put this inside my website, I can just go inside my website here. I can click F12 to go inside my developer tool, go inside my form down here, and I can just go ahead and remove my required attribute. And there we go. I can now hack this website and bypass it. So it's very easy to do. So do not rely on HTML or CSS or JavaScript for any sort of security, only for extra things, so to speak. So having said that, let's go and go back inside our signup and actually create a error handler for checking if every input are actually filled out before the user actually submits the form. So what I'm going to do is I'm not just going to write the code directly in here, because that is not organized. That is not the appropriate way to do things, because all of a sudden we have a lot of code inside this file here. So let's go ahead and split up the task to our different files. So now you have to ask yourself, okay, so what are we trying to do here? Are we trying to query the database? Are we trying to show something inside the website? Are you trying to take some user data and do something with it? Yes, we are. So we're going to go inside our controller file, which is up here. So our signup_controller.inc.php is what we have to use. So inside my controller, I'm going to go and create a function, which is going to have a name. That name is going to be isInputEmpty. So is_input_empty. And this is just, one of many ways you could name functions. Just to point it out, some people prefer to use camel case. Other people like to use underscores. So this is just a little bit easier for people to tell what this function is, at least from my eyes, when it comes to naming these functions here. But inside this function, what I can do is I can pass in some parameters. So inside my parameters here, I want to pass in a username. So I'm going to say we have a variable called username. I do also want to pass in a password and a email, because I have to check if any of these were not submitted when the user submitted this sign-up form. And remember, we use these parameters here to pass in data from outside the function. So this is important to have. So inside the function itself, I'm going to run a if condition. And inside this if condition, we have a built-in function called empty, which is basically checking if one of these variables are empty or if they have data inside of them. So I'm going to grab my username, put it in here, and check, is this one empty, or is another one of these empty? So I can actually copy paste here and just simply check for the password. I can also copy paste again, and then we can check for the email. And these two pipe symbols here means or inside our condition. So if this one is empty, or this one is empty, or this one is empty, then we want to run a certain block of code. So in this case here, this would actually mean there is a error inside our form because they did not fill in one of the inputs if this one is actually true. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here and say I want to return a true Boolean. And then I'm going to run a else condition and say I want to return a false Boolean. And in this sort of way, we can now go in and actually check, is there a error when the person tried to submit their username, password, and email because they did not fill in the inputs. So now saving this, I can actually go and copy the name. I can go back inside my signup.inc.php file. And inside my error handlers here, I'm going to create a if condition that is simply going to check if this one returns as true or if it returns as false. Because if it returns as true, then we do actually have a error inside the website. So in this case here, if this returns as true by just pasting in the function, And at this point here, I'm actually going to wait with putting in the code for the actual error message inside this condition here, because we do have a couple of different ways we could do it. And I do have a way that we are going to do it in this video here, but it's not going to make sense until a little bit later on. So let's go ahead and wait with this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a second function that is going to check for something else. In this case, we can actually check if it was a valid email that the user actually submitted. So what I can do is I can go back inside my controller. I can copy this function here. Just copy paste it below, and I can call it something different. So in this case, if you could say something like is email invalid. So is underscore email underscore invalid. And now at this point here, we're only checking for a email. So we don't actually need to have the password or the username. So we can just go and delete those two from the parameters here. And inside the condition here, I'm just going to go and delete these empty functions, because we're not going to check if they're empty. We're actually going to run a filter. So we're going to say filter underscore var, which is a built-in function inside PHP. And inside this one, we can tell it what do we want to filter for. So in this case here, I want to filter my email. So I'm going to paste in my email as the first parameter. And then I want to tell it what exactly do I want to filter here. And in this case, I want to filter to validate if this is a proper email. So filter underscore validate underscore email. And this is actually a built-in validation inside PHP. So you can actually check if this is a valid email. If that is the case, then right now we're returning this as true. And if that is not the case, then we return it as false. But this is the opposite of what we want to do. We do actually want to say if this is a invalid email, then return as true. So we're going to go in here and write exclamation mark, which means the opposite. So in this sort of way, we now have a function that can check if the email is actually valid. And if it is not a valid email, then we return this as true. So again, we can go ahead and copy this, go back inside our signup.inc.php. So I'm just going to go and paste in my function below here and copy the if condition, paste that down below, and simply take this email invalid function and put that inside this condition here. So the next thing we can do here is we can actually go ahead and check if this username that the user tried to submit has been already taken. Because inside the database, you may have many different usernames and you don't want to have two users with the same username. So what we can do is we can run another function inside our controller in order to check for a certain username. And if it exists inside the database, then the user should not be allowed to use that username. So again, we're going to go inside the controller and copy this function and just paste it down. And we're going to rename it into is username taken. And we're just going to go and delete the parameter inside our if condition here. And at this point, I do actually want to point something out, which is that right now, we want to run a function that has to go inside our database and check for a username, which means that we have to query our database. But now I did talk about this earlier. I said that we have three different files. We have one called a model that takes care of querying the database. Then we have the view that shows information inside the website, and our controller takes care of any sort of information. So in this case here, what do? Do we go inside this controller here and then we query the database? Because that's a no-no. Only one file is allowed to actually query the database and interact with the database inside our code, which is our model file. But before we do that, we do actually need to do some type declaration here because we didn't actually do that. So right now, our username up here is actually supposed to be passed in as a string data type. Or at least that's what I decide this is going to be, because the username is a string of characters, so that is going to be a string data type. I'm going to do the same thing for our password and our email, since that is also going to be a string. Then I'm going to go below here inside my email invalid function and do the same thing, because this is also going to be a string. I'm going to go below here and say I want to pass in a username that is also going to be a string. So this sort of type declaration here is not something you have to do, but it just adds another layer of error prevention inside your code, because if I were to pass in a Boolean inside my function here, then it would tell me inside the website, hey, that is a incorrect data type. So it's just an extra layer of error protection. You could also go after here and say what the return type should be. So if this has to return as a Boolean, meaning a true or false statement, then I can say bool right after here and say that is going to be the return type. But let's not go into that right now. Let's just go and talk about telling it what kind of data we expect inside our parameters here. So having talked about that, let's actually go back inside our model page and continue what we're doing right here. So right now we're trying to query the database in order to check if a username is already taken. So going inside my model page, we're going to go below here, create a function. give it some kind of name. In this case here, I could call it get_username. And I can go ahead and say I want to pass in a username because we need to use the username in order to actually query the database to tell if the username exists in there. So we have to pass in a username. Again, remember we're using strict types here. So we can actually say we want to declare this as a string called username. So now at this point here, we do actually need to run a PDO connection in order to do this. And right now our PDO connection is inside our dbh.inc.php file. So there's a couple of ways we could do this. We could go in here and actually go ahead and require our file here. So require _once and link to our dbh.inc.php. But that is not actually necessary because we do actually have that linked inside our signup page. So at the top here, we will link to these files up here. We do have the database connection linked up here first before we actually access these files down here. So going inside the model here, I can actually go ahead and pass that inside as a parameter here. So this is going to be a object data type. So not a string or a Boolean. This is actually a object data type. Because this is a PDO object that is going to connect to our database. Again, we haven't talked about object or enter.php, so just for now, just trust me. This is a object data type. So this is going to be our variable called PDO, which is of course the same variable we have inside our dbh.inc.php, which is right here. So now all we need to do is actually query the database because now we do have our connection passed into this function here. So going down, I can say that we have a variable. I'm going to call this one query. I'm going to set it equal to a string, which is going to be the query for our database. So in this case, it's going to be a select statement. I'm going to select my username from inside this table here because that's the only thing we need to check for. So there's no need to grab all the data. In this case, we can just say username from our users table. And then I want to say where a username is equal to a placeholder that we're going to call username. And in this sort of sense here, remember the semicolon at the end, by the way, we now have a query statement that we can actually query into the database using our connection. But we do need to do this in a secure way using prepared statements. So below here, I'm going to create a variable and call this one stmt for statement. And we're going to set this one equal to our PDO connection. And then we want to point to a method called prepare, which means that now we're creating a prepared statement. And I'm going to pass in my query and send this one in separately. Because by sending in our query separately from the actual data from the user, we now separate the data from the actual query, which makes this something that is going to prevent SQL injection, which is a good thing. So having done this, what I can now do is I can actually bind the data to this query and send that separately. So first of all, we have to bind the data. So we're going to say we have our statement, point to a method called bind param. Parentheses. And inside of here, we have to tell it what is the name of the placeholder. In our case, it is going to be username. So I'm going to paste that in as a string. And then I want to tell it what is the data I want to put in where this placeholder is. In this case, it is going to be our username. And then we simply run a execute statement. So we want to take our statement here, point to a execute method. And this will actually go in and actually query our database using this SQL statement up here. So now that we did that, we need to actually check if we did actually grab a raw data when we search for a username called whatever the user typed inside the input. So in order to do that, we are going to write a variable called result. And we're going to set it equal to our statement and refer to a method called fetch. Now fetch is only going to grab one piece of data from inside the database, so it's not called fetch all, it's just called fetch. So in this case, we're just grabbing the first result. Now the fetch type is going to be a PDO type, and I want to refer to fetch underscore assoc, which means that I want to fetch this as a associative array. This basically means that we can refer to the data inside the database using the name of the column inside the database, which is a much better thing than using indexed arrays. So in this sort of way here, we can now take this data and return it. So we're just going to go ahead and return our variable result, which means that when we run this function here, we grab the data, or if the username does not exist inside the database, then we get a false statement. So now we copy the name of this function, we go back inside our controller, and we paste that function inside our if condition. Now we do need to remove these type declarations in here, so we're just going to say we don't want to have those because we don't need them when we actually call upon the function. We do also need to make sure we pass in our connection inside this function here, otherwise this is not going to work. So we do need to say we want to pass it in, and we want to make sure this is a object type. So doing this here is basically going to go inside the if condition and then check, is the username inside the database? If it is, then we return this as true. If it is not, then we return this as false, meaning that this is going to be an error if the username is already taken, or not an error if the username is not taken. So again, we can go back inside our signup.inc.php, go down and copy one of these if conditions, paste it below, and change the name to what we called it inside our controller. So we can just copy the name of this function here, go back inside and paste that inside our if condition. Of course, again, remove the type declarations because we don't actually need those when we use the functions. And in this sort of way here, we now have something that goes in and actually checks for a username. So now I'm going to do one last thing inside my error handlers here. And it's very important to point out that you can do many different types of error handlers. You can also check for the length of the username or the password or the email or whatever. I'm just going to go ahead and do a couple of different ones here. And then you kind of get the idea that we can just do this. And you can come up with any sort of error handler, write a function for it, and then refer to it inside a if condition inside our signup.inc.php file. So it's the same process every single time, basically. So what I want to do here is I want to copy paste my if statement because I do want to include one last error handler. I'm just going to go and delete the function from in here because we don't have it yet. And I'm going to go inside my signup_controller and I'm going to create the last function. So in this case, I'm just going to copy paste one of these functions here. I'm going to change the name so it's not is username taken, but is email registered. In this case here, we do also need to query the database because we have to check for a email. So I do also want to make sure I include my database connection inside this function here. I do also want to make sure I pass in my email. So not the username in this case, so the email. And inside the if condition here, we're just going to go and delete our function because we want to run a different function now. So again, because we have to query the database to see if there is an email inside the database, we have to do the exact same thing as we did with the username, just using a email instead. So we do actually need to go back inside our model and create a second function that is only going to check for a email. So in this case, if we can say get email, and all we have to do is change a couple of different variables in here. So right now we're passing in a email. I want to go inside and check my email column. I do also want to change the parameter here or the placeholder to email. I do also want to change the name that I'm binding inside my bind parameter method down here. So it's going to be the email variable and also the email placeholder. And with this is all we needed to do in here. So we can go ahead and copy this, go back inside our controller, and paste that inside our if condition. And of course, do also make sure you remove these different type declarations because we don't need those inside the function when we call upon the function. And with all this, we basically now just check for an email being inside the database because it was pretty much the same thing as before. So it's very easy to do. So going inside our signup, we can go ahead and copy the name of this function here and paste that inside our condition. And of course, remove the type declarations like so. And at this point here, we need to talk about how we can actually create these error messages because now we have a bunch of functions that check for different things. And if one of them return as true, it means that there is a error. So what I can do is I can go above my different conditions here and I can create an array, which is going to be empty. I'm going to call this one errors. So I'm going to say we create a errors array, which is going to be equal to no data. And what we basically do is if there is an error inside one of these conditions down here, then we assign that error inside this array up here. So we're going to stack a bunch of data inside this array, depending on how many errors we get inside our code. And then at the end, if we have any sort of errors inside the array, then it means we get an error because there is an error in there. And then we're going to prevent actually signing up the user because if there's an error, then we shouldn't sign up the user. So what we can do here is I can actually go ahead and go inside the first condition and say I want to actually assign a piece of data to my array. So I can say we have a variable which is called errors, and I want to go ahead and say brackets is equal to some piece of data, which in this case is just going to be a string. So right now I have to tell it what is going to be the associative name for this particular piece of data. So this is the key, this is the value. So if I want to grab this particular error message here, then I need to refer to this particular key in here. That is basically what is happening. Again, if you're a little bit confused about when it comes to arrays, I do have an array episode where I talk about arrays extensively. So this should be something you know by now. For now, let's just go and go inside our array and create a key for this particular piece of data. I'm going to call this one empty input. So empty underscore input. And I'm going to create a error message. So in this case, we can say something like fill in all fields, exclamation mark. Then I'm going to do the same thing for all these other ones down here. So I can go down and paste in my code. And I can change this one not to empty input, but instead we can say invalid email. Invalid underscore email. Make sure we actually spell that correctly. Invalid. Change the error message to invalid email used. Then we're going to go inside the next arrow down here, which is if the username is taken. And I can go ahead and say we can call this key something else. So this is going to be username underscore taken. And I'm going to call the error message something else. Username already taken, exclamation mark. Then we can go inside the last one down here and say this is going to be email underscore used. And then we can change the error message to email already registered. And at this point here, if there was no errors, meaning that none of these actually returned as true and insert this data inside our array, it means that our array is going to be empty, because if there's no errors, then we didn't put any data inside our array. So now all we have to do is run a condition and check if this array is empty. If it is, then it means we had no error messages, but if it is not, then we need to send the user back to our index page, where the sign up form is, with error messages. So I'm going to check if we did have errors. This is going to return as true, by the way, if there is actually data inside this array. If there's no data, then it returns as false. And this is going to return as true if there is data inside this array, and it's going to return as false if there's no data inside this array. So what I can do is I can go inside this condition here, and I'm actually going to go ahead and create a session variable. So I'm going to say we have a $_session. And I'm going to set this one equal to error signup, or at least call this one error signup. And I'm just going to go ahead and assign some data to it, which is going to be all the error messages that we have stored inside our errors array. So I'm going to assign that to it. But now at this point here, we don't actually have a session started, so we can actually run these error messages, because we need to actually have a session started before we can actually store session data inside a session. So what I can do right above where we actually assign these errors to our session variable is I can actually link to our config file, because that has a session started inside that file. So I'm going to go up here and just copy paste my require, go down below, paste it in. Then I'm going to change this to config_session.inc.php. Because like I said, inside this file here, we do actually have a connection started. So we could just run this line of code. So I could just take this, go back inside my sign up and just replace that with this line of code instead. But because we do have a much safer way of doing things when it comes to sessions inside that file, so instead we can just link to that file in order to start a much safer session. So with this in here, we can now actually assign this session variable to a value and have that stored inside our session. So now what I can do is I can actually go below here and I can link back to our index page where we have our sign up form, because we need to go back to that page and run some error messages. So I'm going to run a header function, and I'm just going to go ahead and copy paste what we have down here, since that is going to be the same thing. So we're going to go back to the index page, and because we have all the errors stored inside our session, we can actually go ahead and print those out inside our page. So let's actually go and go back inside our index page and do that right now, because why not? We are at the error messages, so why not just show them already? So right underneath my sign up form, I'm going to run a PHP function that we haven't created yet. So I'm going to say we have our PHP tags. I'm going to close it again, and I'm going to refer to a function called check_signup_errors, parentheses, semicolon. And now because we're actually outputting something now using PHP from the sign up system, we're now going to jump inside our view.inc.php file. So our signup_view is going to have a function inside of it, which is going to be what we just created inside our index page. So we're going to say we have a function. We're going to call this one check_signup_errors. Then we want to open up the actual function here. And inside this function, I first of all want to run a if condition, because I want to actually check if we have these errors stored inside the session. Because if there's no error stored inside the session, it means there's no error messages. So inside the parameters, we can run a isSet function and actually check for one of these session variables. So in this case here, I'm going to check if we have our errors underscore signup, which is going to be the session variable we have inside our signup.inc.php that we did actually create down here. And if we have that, I want to go inside this condition and I want to create a variable called errors. And I want to set it equal to our $_session. Actually, we're just going to copy paste from up here, which means that now we have a variable inside our PHP code, which is equal to this array that has all our errors inside of it. So this is actually an array now. Now, the reason we're doing this is because we do actually want to unset our session variables because, like we talked about in previous session security episodes, as soon as you have data inside your session variables that you don't need to have anymore, you need to make sure you actually delete them. So at the bottom here, I'm going to run a unset function that is going to unset my session variable. Because once I'm done running this script here, I don't actually need this data inside our session anymore. So we're just going to go ahead and remove it again right afterwards. So in between here, we're going to go ahead and actually run the error code. So first of all, I'm going to run a small break just because I want to get some distance from the actual form. This could also be done using HTML if you wanted to. But inside my code here, I'm just going to go and create a break. And then below here, I'm going to run a for each loop, because that is a loop type that is used in order to loop out an array. So I'm going to grab my errors array and say I want to refer to that one. And then I want to say as variable error, which means that this is the placeholder for one of these data inside this array here. And inside my for each loop, I'm just going to go ahead and echo out a paragraph. Again, I'm just going to copy paste from my notes here. So I have a paragraph that has a class to it because I have some CSS inside my website here. And in between these paragraphs here, I'm just going to go ahead and concatenate my code. So I'm going to say I want to concatenate and I want to go ahead and refer to my error. And in this sort of way, we now loop out every error message below each other inside this page here. So at this point here, we do actually have a error system working. Now we could also say sign up success once we're actually done. But let's go and wait with that until the end, because we do actually have a little bit more code inside our signup.inc.php file. And once we've done that, then we can return to this in order to actually run our successful message. So now in order to test this out, we're going to go back inside our index page and actually link to our file, because right now we don't actually have our signup_view.inc.php linked inside our index page. So in order to actually access the functions, we need to go at the top here, create a pair of PHP opening and closing tags. And then we're going to say we want to require _once, and I want to link to my includes folder. And inside the includes folder, I have a signup_view.inc.php. We do also need to make sure we have a session started, otherwise this is not actually going to run this code, because we need to have a session available to us to grab the error messages. So I'm also going to link to my config file. So I'm going to go inside my includes folder, link to my config_session.inc.php. And doing this, we can now go back inside our website and actually test this out. We're going to go ahead and refresh the browser just to reset everything. And now if we were to go inside my sign up form and try to sign up without typing something inside my inputs, you can see we get fill in all fields and invalid email used, because right now we didn't type in a proper email and we did not fill in everything inside the form. So if we were to type something in, so for a username, a password, a invalid email, you can see that, oh, we get a invalid email used because that was actually wrong. If I were to type in a non-existing username from inside my database, a password, and a correct email, so I could just say example@gmail.com, and then click sign up, then you can see we get something, it actually puts us to the next page because now we type something valid into our sign up form. But of course, we haven't yet created something to actually sign us up inside the website. So right now, it's not going to do anything. Now we're just stuck inside our signup.inc.php page. But just know that now we have something that actually writes out error messages once we do actually create some sort of error inside our code. So back inside our signup.inc.php file, we can actually continue in order to actually sign up the user inside our website. So what I'll do is I'll go below here and I'm going to run a function called create_user parentheses semicolon, because at this point here, we don't actually have any errors caught by the error handlers that we created inside our code. So we can actually go ahead and run this function here. So in order to do that, we need to go inside our controller. I'm going to copy paste one of the functions, and I'm going to call this one create_user, which is the one that we just created inside the sign up page. And I'm going to paste in our connection because that is important. And then we do also need to paste in all the different data that the user actually submitted. So I'm just going to go and copy paste it here. So we need to paste in the password, the username, and the email. And then going inside our actual function, we can go and delete what we have here. And we're just basically going to run a function from inside our model page. So we're going to say we want to run a function called set_user, parentheses. And then we're just going to go and paste all the same data as we pasted inside this function here. So we're just going to go and paste that in. Make sure we remove the type declarations just like before. We're going to save this and then go inside our model page. And then we're actually going to create a new function. And we're going to call this one the same thing as we did inside the last function. So set_user. And of course, paste in all the data, including our type declarations inside the parameters here. Curly brackets, and then we can actually go inside one of these other functions and just copy paste the query and the execute. So this block of code right here, paste it inside our function. And then we're just going to go ahead and change the statement from a select statement to a insert statement. So we can say insert into users. We're going to include the column name. So we have a username. We also have a password and we have a email. Then we're going to say values, which is going to be what is inside these parentheses. So again, we're going to use placeholders. So this is going to be username, and we're going to include a password, and we're also going to include a email. And then we just need to bind the parameters down here. So we can actually copy paste in the username. We can copy this down 2 more times and paste in the password. We can paste in the email, and this is all we have to do. But now we did also talk about hashing in the previous episode because we need to make sure that when we paste in this password, that it can't be read from inside the database. So right before we bind the parameters, I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to call this one options because I want to include a couple of options inside an array. And this is going to contain a cost factor, which is going to be called cost. And we're going to set this one equal to 12. And this essentially is just going to make it cost quite a bit more in order to actually run this hash. And this is going to prevent the hackers from actually brute forcing their way into your website. So this is important. Then we're going to go below here and actually run a hash. So we're going to say we have something called hashed password. And I'm going to set this one equal to a function called password underscore hash, parentheses, semicolon. And then we need to tell it what exactly we're trying to hash here. So in this case, you want to hash the password that was submitted by the user. And I'm going to run a hashing algorithm called password underscore bcrypt. And I'm also going to go ahead and pass in my options, which is the variable we created up there. And this is basically going to hash our password using the bcrypt algorithm and also go ahead and add a cost factor to it. So it's going to slow down the brute forcing process if someone were to try and hack their way into your website. So what we can do here is we can actually take our hash password and replace that with our password down where we actually bind our parameters, because now we're storing the hash password and not the real password inside the database. We do also need to make sure inside this array here that we don't set it equal, but we actually assign 12 to our cost, just so we don't get that error message there. So with this, we now actually have this function working. So we can go back inside our signup.inc.php file here, and we need to make sure we actually paste in these parameters. So we could just go back inside our controller, copy all these different parameters here, go back inside our signup.inc.php and paste those in, of course, without all the different type decorations that we have here. So after running this function, we just signed up the user inside our website. So what we can do is we can go down a couple of lines and then we just run a header function and a die function in order to actually stop the rest of the script from running, just in case. And we're going to send the user back to the front page, but we're actually going to include a sign up success message. So we can actually go ahead and say we have a question mark sign up equal to success. And before we end off the script here, so before the die function, I do actually want to close off my connection and my statement. So I'm going to say we have our variable PDO. I'm going to set it equal to null. Then I'm going to copy paste this down. And I'm going to say I want to set my statement equal to null. And in this sort of way, we now have a basic sign-up system working inside our website. So now what we could do is we could actually go inside our website to test this out, but I do want to have our sign-up success message if we do actually do so. So we're going to go and use this little URL parameter here in order to do that. So right now we have a sign-up equal to success displayed inside our URL if this is actually successful. So what I can do is I can go back inside our view function, because this is the one that actually has the error messages, and I can write a else if condition, and then check if we have that inside the URL with the sign up equal to success. Before we do that, let's go ahead and paste in what we actually want to display inside the website. So in my case, I do want to, again, just run a break, but I'm also going to go below here and echo out a paragraph that is going to say sign up success. Inside the condition, I'm going to run a isSet function that is going to check if we have a certain get method inside the URL. So in our case here, we are checking for a $_get, because that is something we can do whenever we have any sort of data displayed inside the URL. For example, sign up equal to success. So I'm going to check for something called sign up, which is going to be the key inside the URL. So we have sign up equal to success. So key equal to value. Okay, just like inside arrays. And I'm also going to go ahead and check if it is equal to a certain message. So it can go right after our isSet function here. Do make sure you do it after the parentheses. So in between these two parentheses at the end here. And I'm going to say, and is my get sign up equal to a certain string? So in this case, success. And having done this, we need to do one more thing that I actually forgot to do inside our signup.inc.php file, which is to go down and inside our errors if condition, I do need to make sure we exit this script if we do have any sort of errors inside our code. Otherwise, it is still going to continue running all this code down here, even if we do get an error message. So we do need to copy this die function here and paste it right below our header, because then we do actually exit this script. And with this, we now have a complete sign-up system, or at least a sign-up system with a error message system. So you can actually see any sort of errors you might have inside your sign-up form. So if we were to go back inside our web page, I can actually refresh everything just to make sure everything is reset. And going inside and typing in a sort of error. So if we were to type something wrong, let's say I did not fill in my password and I wrote a invalid email. If we were to sign up, then you can see we get two error messages down below. We get fill in all fields and invalid email used. So as you can see, we have error messages showing and telling us what we did wrong inside the sign up form. What we can also do here is we can actually sign up inside the web page, because that is something we have set up as well. So if we were to go in here and say I want to sign up as Danny Crossing, and I want to type in 123 as my password, and say I want to type in an email, so I can say crossing@gmail.com, which is not a real email that I have, but just to come with some kind of example here. If I were to click sign up now, you can see sign up success. And then if I were to go inside our database, we now have a user inside our users table. So at this point here, the sign up system is working, but there's one more thing we need to include inside in order for this to be a complete sign up system. At least I think this is a feature that is something you should have inside a sign up system, which is to make sure that if you create any sort of error messages inside the signup form, let's say I went inside my signup form and I wrote in a valid username and I did not type in a password and I did type in a valid email. So let's say we say example@gmail.com. At this point here, if I were to get a error message when I try to sign up because I did not fill in my password, it should send back the data that I already typed in inside this form. So I don't have to retype everything if I get sent back with an error message, because that is just really annoying. So this is more of a usability feature for people to not have to retype everything inside this form here. So in order to create this, I'm going to go back inside my code. And the first thing we have to do is make sure we actually send the data that the user submitted back to our sign up page so we can actually show it inside the inputs. And the second thing we have to do is actually show it inside the input. So we have to do two things in order to get this working here. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to go back inside my errors if statement here, and I'm actually going to create an array that is going to contain all the data submitted by the user so we can send it back to our index page. So if we have some sort of errors, then I want to go in here before the header function, by the way, and create a array. And in this case, I'm going to call this one sign up data. And we're going to set this one equal to an array. So we're going to say brackets and semicolon. And then opening this up, we can now add some data inside our array here. And we're going to do that as a associative array. So we want to have a key and we want to have a value for that key. So the first key I'm going to have in here is going to be the username, because I want to send back the username. And again, this is a name we can come up with ourselves. So you can call this whatever you want. In my case here, I do think username makes sense because this is the username. Then I'm going to assign a piece of data, which is going to be the username the user actually submitted when they tried to sign up inside our form, which is going to be variable username. And the reason I know that is because if I were to scroll up here, I can actually show you that we want to grab all these different data and send that back inside the signup form, or at least all the data except for the password, because I do think the password is something you have to retype every single time in case you get something wrong inside your input. And that is just kind of something you see inside websites typically. So we're not going to send back the password, but any other kind of data we are going to send back inside the index page. So going back down, I'm going to assign the second piece of data, which is going to be our email, or at least the user's email they tried to sign up with. So this is going to be called email, and we're going to copy that and paste it over inside our variable here. So now we have the actual data inside an array, and now we have to actually send it back by assigning it inside a session variable, just like we did up here. So I can actually copy this session variable that we have, paste it down below, and we're just going to go ahead and change the names in here. So we can actually go ahead and say signup_data. And then we can go ahead and say this is going to be equal to our signup data. So with this here, we can now send the data back to our signup form. So what I can do is I can go inside my index page. And what we need to do now is just basically take all these inputs from inside our signup form, and we're going to replace it with a piece of PHP code that is going to check if we did actually have some data sent back to this form here, because then I want to show a different version of these inputs here. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to copy all my inputs here just so I have them, and I'm going to delete them. And then I'm going to go inside my signup_view.inc.php file, since we now have to show something inside our page. And like we talked about, we have the model view and controller, and the view is going to take care of showing something inside the web page. So what I'll do is I'll create another function. So I'm going to go below my declare here and create a function. And I'm going to call this one signup_inputs. Just to give it some kind of name. Then I'm going to go inside, and I'm just going to paste in my HTML for now. So now what we have to do is create a couple of conditions that are going to check if we have this data being sent back to our signup form because of an error message. And if that's the case, then I want to include that data inside my inputs here instead of having just the regular inputs with no data. So what I need to do is go below here and create a if condition. And inside this if condition, I want to check if we have a certain session variable existing inside our web page, which is going to be the one that has all the data inside of it. So going inside of here, what I can do is I can write a isSet function, which checks if a certain session variable is currently set inside the page. So I can check for a session variable, so $_session. And I'm going to check if we have something called signup_data. But now I do want to check for a specific piece of data inside this signup_data array. So what I can do is I can create my brackets afterwards here and refer to a certain key inside this array here. So right now I want to check if we have something called a username. So if we have this, it means that we did not leave any input empty for this particular input. So now we're actually also checking if there was any empty input. So we don't actually have to check for that particular error message, but we do need to check for another error message, because what if I picked a username that already exists inside the website? Because if I did that, it means that I need to retype the username because it is already taken. So in that case, I don't want to type the username that the user submitted because it is wrong and it needs to be changed, right? So we also want to check for certain error messages in here. The way we can do that is going afterwards. Make sure it's after the first parentheses over here. And we're going to write a AND condition, and we want to check for another isSet. So what I can do is I can copy paste this session that we have here, paste it inside my isSet statement. And in this case, we're not checking for signup_data, but we're checking for errors_signup. And then inside our errors_signup, we have a specific error message that we want to check for. So in this case here, it is going to be username_taken. Username_taken. But we do also need to keep in mind here that I want to show the data inside the input if this error message does not exist inside our website. So I do need to write a exclamation mark in front of my isSet function here. So right now we're checking if we do actually have the data available because the user submitted some data. And if we do not have this error message inside the web page, then I want to actually show the actual data the user submitted inside an input. So we can actually copy paste what we have up here with the username. And I can go down and say I want to echo. Then I'm going to say single quotes in order to not mess up any HTML here, because we are using double quotes inside the HTML. And then I'm going to close it off here. And now the way we actually show data inside an HTML input, and again, this is HTML, this is not PHP knowledge, is by actually going in and adding a value attribute. And then I'm simply going to close off the HTML by using single quotes. And then I'm going to concatenate some PHP code. And I'm going to paste in my data from inside our session. So I can actually go ahead and copy that from up here inside our condition and paste that in inside our value. Then I want to run a else condition, because if this is not the case and we did not have any sort of data sent back and we did maybe have an error message, then I do actually want to go in and show the regular input without any sort of value inside of it. So I do need to echo that out as well. So I'm going to echo out single quotes, paste it in, and semicolon. And this is basically all we need to do for these different inputs here. So now the second one is going to be our password. And in this case here with the password, we did already talk about that I did not send the password back because I do want the user to retype it no matter what happens. So in this case here, we do actually just need to echo out our input for the password. So we can just go ahead and copy paste our password input here, single quotes, and paste it in, and semicolon. But when it comes to the email input, we do actually want to copy paste this if else condition up here, paste it below. And then I want to use my email instead. So instead of checking for signup_data username, I want to check for a email. I do also want to make sure we're not checking for a error message that is called username_taken, but instead I want to check for a email_used, because that is the error message we had inside our signup.inc.php. If we were to scroll up here, you can see we have email_used. But now we do also have a second error message when it comes to our email, which is actually called invalid_email. So we do need to check for that as well, because if you have more than one error message for one particular input, then that is important to check for as well. So going back inside our view, I'm going to copy paste from where we actually check for the and all the way over to the first parentheses, copy that, and then paste it in right afterwards here, because now we can actually check for a second error message. Do make sure you have all the parentheses correct and all the single quotes and double quotes, because that will mess up something inside your web page if you do not have everything set correctly. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and change the second error message from email_used to invalid_email, because that is the error message for that particular one. So now all we have to do is make sure we replace the actual echoes down here. So I'm going to copy paste my email. I'm going to go down below and paste it in instead of these echoes that we have in here, in both places, by the way. So both inside the if condition and inside the else condition. And then we just need to make sure we also add in the value inside the first one up here. So I'm just going to go up, going to copy the value, make sure you copy it exactly like I am here. So after the double quote at the end there, but also before the angle bracket. So copy that, go back down and paste it in right after the placeholder. So space and paste in, and then just go ahead and change the actual data inside of here from username to email. Go back up to the top here, delete these HTML things that we just pasted in just for reference. And now what we need to do is just copy paste our signup_inputs function, go inside our index page and actually spit this out inside our form. So if we were to go inside the form here where we had the inputs before, I can say I want to open up my PHP tags and close it again, and just simply write out my function. And in this sort of way, we should now have our actual data being shown back inside the forms if I were to type some sort of error message. So if I were to go back inside and refresh everything inside my page here. So if I go back inside my form and type a random username, so just something gibberish, write something random inside the password, and let's go ahead and create a invalid email. So in this case here, when I click the sign up button, we should not have any sort of data inside the email field, but we should have something inside our username field. So if we were to click sign up here, you can see, oh, okay, invalid email used. We still have the data inside our username, but it did actually remove the data from inside the email, which is what is supposed to happen. So if I were to go in here and say I want to type in a username that already exists inside the database, so Danny Crossing, type in a random password, and then let's go ahead and create a valid email. So let's say example@gmail.com. So if I were to actually submit this, it should send me back without the username and without the password, because the username is already taken, right? So if I were to click submit here, you can see that we get sent back without the username, without the password. So as we can see, this is working like intended. So with all of that, we can now go ahead and sign people up inside our web page, and just to double check nothing is being inserted inside the database, because that's always a good idea. You can see that nothing is getting inserted. And with that, we now have a sign up system with both error messages, and we have the data still being inside the forms. If the user were to submit something wrong, so they don't have to retype things, the sign up is actually working inside the sign up system. What I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to split up this video into 2 parts, since this is already pretty long and I don't want you guys to sit here for like 3 hours or something. I don't know, maybe this video is going to be 3 hours long, who knows? So we're going to split this up into a sign up part, and then we're going to have a login part in the next video. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.